is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor at Sacred Heart Parish and the rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother in Oklahoma City. And this is Gaudete Sunday, with its rose-color vestments and the lighting of the pink candle on the Advent wreath. It's part of our regular journey through this time of Advent. Gaudete is the first word from the opening prayer for Mass in Latin, and it means rejoice. This, in turn, is from Philippians 4:4, rejoice in the Lord always. We're preparing ourselves for the coming of Christ into our lives. This is the reason for us to rejoice, that Christ is coming. That's the very definition of Advent, waiting and preparing for Jesus' coming. As St. Bernard wrote 1,000 years ago, there are three comings of Christ. The first is at Christmas, when Christ came and was recognized only by the few who understood what was happening, Mary and Joseph, the shepherds in the fields, and the Magi. These few understood what had happened, and they acknowledged Jesus as the King of all, although he was born a child in a stable, the poorest king ever. The second coming of Christ is when Christ will come in all his glory. At that moment, Jesus, as the King of all the universe, will be made known to the whole world, and the whole world will respond to the promise of glory. What has been hidden will be made known. What was puzzlement will be certain, and all that we wondered about will be cleared up. This is the one to which the great revealing is pointed. In fact, the word for that in Greek, revealing, is apocalypse, which is why the last word in the Bible is called revelation. But the third coming of Christ is the one we're preparing for now. And it's when Christ comes to us, into our lives as a living and certain presence now. Jesus presents himself to us as the promise of the ages, the gift to our humanity, the salvation of souls. And when we grasp this truth and live it, our lives become whole. All of Advent is pointed to our readiness for this coming, since it is the most imminent for us. It's what we're closest to. So Rejoice Sunday is understanding we're exactly poised to recognize and then to grasp Jesus' offer to welcome him into our lives. But let's face it, it doesn't feel like there's all that much to rejoice about. If you turn on the news or look at what's on the internet, it's hard to make sense of this time for rejoicing. What do we have in our time to give thanks for? Because our list of woes would exhaust any paper we'd care to write them down on. Unsettled politics, the risk of war, economic uncertainty, national unrest, a fraught election season coming up, the reports of malfeasance everywhere, and everything else that we're reminded of day after day. This is not the time to feel especially good about the world we know. And beyond this sense of descending darkness, we also know the contrast, because not that long ago, it felt as if the world was turning a corner toward goodness. My sense of time is skewed the longer I live, and I can remember many events and the feelings about them from decades ago. And I still remember when the world seemed a better and more hopeful place than now, because it wasn't all that long ago when the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Prime Minister of Israel stood on the White House grounds and shook hands with one another to celebrate peace between them. Not so long ago, the Soviet Union fell apart, the Cold War was over, and the sword of Damocles of nuclear destruction that was hanging over us was removed. And the possibilities of instantaneous communication and the revolution in world affairs wrought by benevolent technology, why, that was just right around the corner as well. Just a few years ago, the aviation industry, the entertainment industry, the financial sector, they were all talking about record results and a glowing future. And all was light and promise, and we all thought so. But where there once was light, there seems now to be shadow, and it's lengthening. So why rejoice? Why, except for the recognition that if God's going to act, it better be soon? What are we looking forward to? There are three principal moments for rejoicing, all connected. We should describe them in order because they unfold all at once and as part of the same moment, but are distinguished in our experience. They're something like a person's first kiss. When it happens, all the potential for a life-changing event is present, but like any event, it's simply what happens, with its beginning and its end encapsulated as an event. Looking back on it from a lifetime of experience and wisdom, it carries with it a gravity and potential that was unrecognizable at the moment that it takes place. And so it is with the moments that we encounter in our lives now, as we look back across the landscape of our day and time to make sense of God at work among us. Once we see where we are, especially as we learn to look forward while we look back, we understand the reasons that we do have to rejoice. And we should begin with the first thing, which is history. That sounds dull and abstract, I know, but it's simply drawing a true picture of where we are as we look out across the story of our lives. Imagine a child of, say, 8 or a young man of 16 asking you about your grandfather. If you were serious about letting him know what kind of man that grandfather was or what he did, you'd have to spend a little time talking about what the world was like just to make sense of how his life fitted into that world. Just the other day, I ran into a review of a book written by a man who had discovered the letters his grandfather had written to his grandmother during World War II. Now, he had even barely known that his father had been in the army and knew nothing about what he had done there during the war. It turns out that this gray-headed old man had been in the middle of some of the greatest battles of the war, none of which he had ever talked about or referred to, not to his own son, and especially not to his grandson. In the foreword to the book, the author describes his own disappointment that he never had a chance to understand his grandfather's life while his grandfather was alive, or to appreciate it for what it was, because he never understood its context. His grandfather had never talked about his history because he never had thought it important. So the book is an explanation of why it was, in fact, so important. And we should note, it was important not because the author thought the war was glamorous and that his grandfather deserved to be recognized, or that he, the author, deserved to be connected to the glamour of the war through his family's lineage, but because it was part of his grandfather's life, and he wanted to know who this man was. And it's this way with all of us. We deserve to know our own lives, and so we are due the history that we're a part of. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that we stand on the shoulders of all those who came before us. We ought to know where we're standing because of them. And while we look at the news and wonder about what is to come, we should also stop and appreciate a few things about what has been. Thanks to our history, we're not facing a world in which we dread, for example, the coming of winter because we don't have enough to eat. None of us go into our cellars to count the potatoes and wonder if we'll have enough to get to June when the next crop will be ready. And if we don't find what we need, then start worrying about what our alternatives will be. We're not fearful where our next meal will be coming from or what we might be eating in the cold of February. Our society has made such worries, which would have been a major concern for almost all of human history, they've made them unthinkable. Our prosperity is amazing. It's also invisible to us as a society, but it's real. And we also don't worry about what that cloud of dust on the horizon might mean. In other days and times, it might have meant the arrival of the Mongol hordes, or perhaps a Comanche raiding party, or the approach of the panzers on the road to Moscow. Whichever version of a fearful future is embodied by those possibilities, our predecessors had to face the prospect of what to do in the face of such dreadful threats. A slight haze dimming the morning sun, signaling the end of all joy for everyone. That was a regular feature of life across the globe, and we can hardly imagine it, much less feel it in our bones like they could. Safety and security, they are our presumption. Random violence and the friction of life, they're unavoidable in a fallen world, but we, right now, are not lying awake at night wondering if the children in their beds will come to see the new year or not. And the greatest lesson of history is to know our history. That is to say, whatever evil or awfulness we're facing today, we have faced in the past. The great antidote to the fear of today is to know more about yesterday, because yesterday was an authentically awful place. Are you worried about venal and compromised politicians? Well, then read Robert Caro's books on the life of LBJ, or Nigel Hamilton's book on the life of JFK, or Doris Kearns' book about the despicable personalities surrounding Abraham Lincoln as he tried to govern as president. You'd be a lot less worried about what the guys in Washington are up to these days. Are you worried about government overreach and the Wild West attitude of those tasked to protect us and to guard our freedoms? Then read Gage's biography of Herbert Hoover or Weiner's history of the CIA. You'll be glad there are congressional hearings in which criticisms can be spoken out loud, and our representatives and senators can complain and ask questions and demand answers. It wasn't always so in the past, when fear was everywhere and retribution was agency policy. Or prepared or anxious about military preparedness and the attitude of officers and leaders whose job it is to make us secure? Then read Bruce Catton on the Civil War, or William Manchester on Douglas MacArthur, or listen to the YouTube video on the conduct of the U.S. Navy during the opening days of World War II by the producer called Jacques Fennell. The great truth often repeated is that wars are won by those who make the least mistakes. It turns out wars are also won even though there are whole swaths of people in the military who are dedicated to making the same mistakes over and over. Are you uncertain about the Pope or the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, the people of the church? Then take a look at the Borgia popes, or perhaps the history of the Reformation, or even the biography of Cotton Mather. In all these cases, you'll be amazed at the holiness and dedication of so many in our current generation. History doesn't excuse incompetence or criminality or foolishness, and it doesn't excuse any of that in our generation. And it certainly is no substitute for rectitude and the pursuit of virtue for its own sake. But it does allow us some measure of peace as we strive to make sense of the world we're a part of. More than that, it gives us a reason to give thanks for where we are and how we've gotten here. Tales of woe and the feelings of helplessness are our inheritance as members of society filled with tragedy and cruelty, but all of the outrages of our time do not define the world or limit it to one sole narrative. Our own lives today, they're filled with every story of hope and every example of self-sacrifice and every moment of transcendent vision with which we have been endowed. We've gotten here thanks to those who brought us here, and we shouldn't forget it. We have a right to rejoice in what they've given us. The history we've been given also has been given for our good. Upon examination, we know it's not a slowly rising arc to goodness in life because there's disappointment and repression and cruelty out of season aplenty everywhere. But with all of its wandering, our history is God's gift to us. It's the realization of the divine promise of God's kingdom of hope. We're not just flailing around as a brown wheat skittering in the wind. We're on our way to the fullness of God's plan for the whole world. That's what we've been given, and that's toward which we are directed. At the bottom of all that comes to us, God is at work in the world to bring about the divine among us, and we trust in His promise. The second thing on our list is an old topic much revived by the meditations and the explanations of the Second Vatican Council, and it's this: incarnation. Of course, we're referring to the truth of God taking on flesh and entering our world. That's the major theme of the Advent season. Jesus' birth to Mary is the truth of God entering our world in order to save it. It's the first and most startling of the actions God undertakes to bring us everything necessary for our rescue from the blood and tear-soaked meanness of our world. We often don't focus enough on this aspect of the faith, although it is part of the creed we profess every Sunday. But it's important. In fact, the Orthodox Church, following so much of the emphasis of the early church fathers, they highlight this in the decoration of their churches. Instead of having a crucifix hanging in their sanctuaries as a reminder of the death of Jesus for our salvation, they have icons of Mary and John the Baptist hanging at the entranceway to the altar. Mary brought about the incarnation of Christ and His entrance into the world, and John let the world know of His coming. Jesus' entering the world, that was the moment of its salvation. This we celebrate as a foundation stone of the church. As St. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote, God became man at the incarnation so that man could become God. It's hard to get better than that. But there's more to it than that. The first and the greatest gift of the incarnation is that by entering our world, Jesus dignified our humanity. The Son of God is a human being. He lives and dies as a human body. What is human is dignified and blessed in every way. Think about it. We believe Jesus lived and died as a human being. He achieved the salvation of the world by way of his humanity, not in spite of it. Jesus felt as we feel as human beings: hunger and fear, anger and relief, exhilaration and disappointment, frustration and accomplishment, the search for a proper bathroom and gladness in finding one. Everything you can think of as part of the human story, Jesus also encountered, which means each of these aspects of the human story is part of the salvation Jesus achieved in the world. Jesus made what is human the pathway to what is holy and divine. What there is of us counts. Our bodies are not just stuff we haul around to keep our organs functioning so that we can live long enough to go to heaven. And neither are they sacks that we can turn inside out or empty out to use as flags or doorstops or to plug holes. We, in our flesh, we are the embodiment of the gift of salvation. These bodies that we are not dispensable or throwawayable. They're the vessels of God at work in the world for the world. How else will God bring the goodness of the divine and the glory of the transcendent into the world except through us by way of our bodies? How else will the world come to know what God is or is up to except by what we do and say and promise in our bodies? In addition, the gift of the incarnation is that God has given us the dignity of ourselves. As the Fathers at Vatican II wrote, Jesus came in the world to make us human. About 20 years ago, an author published a book in which she decried the ongoing violence in the world. Reflecting on the terrorist attack of 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it seemed as if violence was taking over everywhere. If only our politics were not so venal and our intentions were not so dark, she wrote, and we didn't invoke God to defend our politics, our world would be much more on the side of the angels. But in her reflections, it never occurred to her to look at the rest of the world. She, for example, didn't count 1 million pregnancies terminated in the womb as 1 million act of violence. That death toll was, for her, mere liberation. In her anxiety, she forgot the potential of a truly human life, in which all lives are valued and each person is a gift, whether they're wanted or unwanted. Take your eyes off Christ, and it's easy to become something other than fully human, fully awake, and fully alive. We rejoice in the promise that God wants us to be authentically human. We're not made so as to be subservient to God, but so as to be fully the beings we were created to become. God glories in humanity, fully alive. And in our humanity, lived out to its fullest potential in the world to come, in which goodness is presumed and virtue can run wild, God is glorified. Awaiting the coming of Christ into our lives so as to become the presence of Christ in the world, this is the promise of our joy. And finally, we rejoice that God has tilted the world in our direction. The fulfillment of God's will is the story of the world we're all a part of. It seems almost silly to say such a thing in the light of the histories of the 20th century and its rows of tombstone and its crisscross of barbed wire and guard towers. But we do believe God has summed the gift of his initiative into our place and time. We're given the promise of God right here and right now, all rolled into the gift of God's continual graces at work. On the day of the resurrection, as the women came to the tomb to complete the ghastly work of preparing Jesus' body for burial, they arrived with every expectation they carried there of their place and time. More than anything, they knew goodness is extinguished by power, virtue will be dimmed by evil, and the final vote on any promise is death and its permanency. When they got to the tomb, all of those expectations were emptied out, as the tomb was. Nothing from that moment on would remain the same, not in their lives and not in the life of the world. Everything changed as they encountered Jesus risen. And it has been changing throughout the moments of the world since then. Every part of the world built on their premises began to fall apart in the morning light of Easter Sunday. And the falling apart has continued up to this moment. Not only are the bonds holding the parts of the world coming undone, their loosening has caused the most solid and the most certain structures to come undone. Their collapse has become the loudest and the most notable, and among us, the most noticed. Our day and time takes place among the ruins of the solidity of society. Virtually nothing remains of what once was. This is the work of the Spirit of God. Jesus said that the Spirit was like the wind that would blow where it willed without knowing where it came from or where it was going. We look around and see the mysteries and the unfathomable among us and are surprised that we're in the midst of a gale in which most things have been turned over or strewn about. We've always thought the Spirit would be a more gentle breeze than a violent thunderstorm. But the world built on fear and intimidation and presumption and death is to be undone, so that the world built on forgiveness, forbearance, faith, and grace might be established. And so it is happening. Oh, not yet in every place. We can be surprised at the ease with which we can accept violence to the least among us in the womb, or in which wicked anti-Semitism can be blandly explained away, or in which rape and torture and kidnapping can be justified as the mere sloppy excesses of liberation, or in which slicing off body parts can be pooh-poohed as nothing but a whim. But in all these outrages, we can also acknowledge that they have reached the light of day. This is small relief to those who suffer the scourge of this depth of darkness, but at least they're dragged into the light and are the subject of concern. In previous ages, such was not the case. It may be the case that democracy dies in darkness, but it is also the case that concern is crushed in crepuscule. When violence is the norm and lying is presumed, darkness covers everything. We're a long way from the kingdom of light and peace, but we're not still in the realm of despair and defeat. The smallest light in the darkest place can be a beacon, and we've been given a torch. That's what we rejoice in. Death has been overthrown. This means the grip of death over everything has been loosened. It's been 2,000 years, and the powers of this world are still at work, throttling every effort to celebrate life and enjoy peace. But they are losing. As Pope Benedict wrote, the triumph of Christ has meant the death of the gods, all the gods. The drama of the world will continue among the backdrop of Christian triumph, but only as pillaging and looting of what is present there. It might not be much to acknowledge that our most notable progress is that we can talk about the outrage of violence and the grotesqueness of murder, but to know it as outside the bounds of truly human living. It is to know we've been led by a great promise. It's this promise in which we rejoice. Gaudete, rejoice, the Lord is coming. He has already come and set the powers of this world fleeing. He waits to come to you, that your humanity might flower and your life blossom. The world waits for Christ, and Christ waits for you. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Las Mañanitas. We all gathered outside in the cold to enact what for them were the old celebrations, so we could bond and fold this new world into traditional ways. And as in everything out of doors, we bundled ourselves, adding more and more of what would keep us warm before the wind would settle and lay. The gathered were comfortable at home there, next to the noted statues where the faith they received is shared so as to be fanned into flame. Bowed in prayer, they ignore the weather to embrace the moment, tethered to the lifeline of all together in a common faith, the same. Powerful to see, even more to feel, the gathering in of so many seals their doubt as they, as one, all kneel before the mystery of belief, such that we all wonder how have we lost this among us now, replaced quiet faith with our loud and noisy cries of relief. What will we surrender to if we are to return to who will give us what we once knew and bring us what we long for? We know it will always be the one who chooses, the great He, beyond the spread of land and sea, who taps gently on our door. That's Las Mañanitas. Christmas approaches, we hope everybody is turning toward the celebration of Jesus' entrance into the world. We hope that in this season and in the year to come, you can join us.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.